So we're here for one reason, and that's this album, At Fillmore East. And the bottom line is what happened to me was I wrote what I thought was a really great 500-page tome on God knows what. And a friend of mine read it, a fellow historian, not affiliated with MTSU or anywhere else. He read the whole thing and he said, "You just wrote a book on At Fillmore East." And I was like, what? And I couldn't quite wrap my head around defining the Allman Brothers sound by a single record of 7 songs, or defining the achievement by just a single record. So what the book talks about is how and why this album represents Duane's musical vision, and also a bit why and how we remember the Allman Brothers Band comes from that as well. So quickly, I don't need, most of y'all know me. Who am I? I'm the patriarch of this crazy crew. That's my wife, Candy, all the way to the right. My 2 daughters who are now in Knoxville rooting for the Vols, in a very good year for the Tennessee Vols, at least at that point. So I guess the question I always say is, how do you know that you can trust me? Well, I'll say this. In the first line of the book, I say flat out, I am completely biased about this band. I know it. And the hardest thing for me to do in doing the research or doing the final writing was to scrub out any last little bit of pure fanboy that I could that didn't come across as super biased. But the biggest reason, I say this to public audiences and I'll say this to my colleagues, the biggest reason you can trust me is because I have documented and footnoted the hell out of this book. And that was very much intentionally. And I also started in the beginning explaining to readers, again, not as much aimed at the academic audience, but that's what history is. I used the book in a certain way to explain to the people who I knew were going to be able to pay tiny bits more attention to the process, how historians use sources, how sources work, how to find out if there's any veracity behind what someone's saying. Now, I'm saying it in a super easy way, right? I'm talking about an artist who had a sound in his mind and how that manifested itself on stage and on record and in the marketplace. But this is true about y'all's work too, and the way that we set things up and the way that we talk to people beyond the other academicians or something like that. So we're going to go back to this. What this album represents to Duane's vision and why we remember him. That's essentially this whole gist of the book and the story. The other thing, I find this story absolutely fascinating. And I hope when you read the book, not if, you'll at least see that element of it. There is a real Southern Gothic quality to it that actually, if I had more time, and I will eventually do this, that manifested itself in the way that the band presented itself from the very beginning, with photographs like this, actually, that is from the Grand Canyon, clearly not the South. But their road manager, Twiggs Linden, stopped on their first big road trip out west, and they took a whole series of pictures. And this adorned their box set that came out in 1989. And it, to me, has always visually represented, because that's about the time when I came around to the band, this sort of concept of what's going on with this band, how special they were. I mean, they were on the road 300 days a year in the first 2 years of their existence, at least with Duane at the helm. They played a couple hundred shows a year, and it cost Duane Allman to the far left and Barry Oakley, who is the other guy sitting down between him and Greg, who's pointing, it cost them both their lives in motorcycle accidents and leaves really a trail of broken relationships behind them. And that is a fact of this story, and it's also something that I knew that I needed to stay away from, because there were a lot of books already written about this, and this was all over the beginning of my dissertation. I remember discussing it a little bit with Chris, how I would approach staying out of that mess. And I did 2 ways to do that with these personal messes. Number 1, I focused on the music. Number 2, I also had an end date before things got super crazy with things like, oh, that's the wrong one. I'll get there in a second. So it's right up my alley. Now, I imagined, 5 pillars really make this story what it is. These are like really key elements to this particular story. The first is Duane Allman himself, and I'll get to that a bit. I did not write a biography of Duane Allman. I didn't write a biography of the Allman Brothers Band. That was not my intention. I wrote a biography of a sound and how that sound manifested itself on an album. The second is place. The third is Duane's bandmates. The fourth is the music industry, and then the fifth are the fans. And to me, that's the part that I would say that there's three of y'all in this room that really helped me sort of make sense of how to present that part of the story into the book. Now, the place is the American South, and it is small towns and suburban towns in the South. On the left, this is near the Daytona Beach band shell, where Duane and Greg are from. On the right, that's actually Macon, Georgia. And in that apartment on the lower left is where I finished writing draft 1 in February of 2021. So, but that picture says to me, South. It says the image of this time. And I didn't intend to take that picture that way, but it really works out very well. This is a story that begins in Florida and migrates very quickly to Georgia, but is really a Southern story. It's the regional South. And when I talk about this, for the most part, we're talking about the states of the Confederacy and the border states. But also, frankly, Southern culture has moved beyond the South all over the place. So there's the regions of the border, the American South. But for the most part, I'm talking the old Confederacy plus maybe the border states that way. Music and culture is where the South's music and culture is what very much dictates this story. Now, I'll share a little bit about stories for this band here. Duane and Greg were actually both born in Nashville. Alan Woody, who was a later member of the Allman Brothers Band, was also born in Nashville. Jack Pearson, who I'm repping today, Murfreesboro's own, is from this area. Deep, deep, deep roots in Middle Tennessee. Upper left is, Duane and Greg both went to elementary school in Nashville at Parmer Elementary. And then the lower left is a postcard I picked up. That's Castle Heights Military Academy in Lebanon, where Duane and Greg actually were sent in separate stints. Their mom sent them up there while she was working on her CPA. Bradley's Barn in Lebanon also is where the Allman Brothers got their first big chance at success. They went and recorded under and with Buddy Killen, and John D. Loudermilk had helped them with some songwriting in the summer of 1966. He discovered them at the Briar Patch in Nashville and took them out to Bradley's Barn, where they recorded a few. Actually, they recorded a single, and it flopped miserably. Later, Buddy Killen reissued the single once the Allman Brothers got famous on an album called Duane and Greg Allman or something like that. But the other big thing that happens in Nashville, besides being born in Nashville, is where Duane and Greg catch the bug to play music, and it's at a review. Details are a little fuzzy about the timing of this. Was it 60 or 61? Greg seemed to remember that it was at Municipal Auditorium, which wasn't even around quite yet. So exactly the date isn't certain. 60, 61, a review show headlined mostly by Jackie Wilson. B.B. King was there. And apparently Duane was just absolutely transfixed. He's about 13, 14 years old. Greg recalls looking at him. Everybody's shaking. The whites are in the balcony, and the black folks are in the better seats. And Duane is absolutely transfixed and turns to Greg and says, "Little brother, we got to get into this thing." And they did. That was about 9 years later. They formed the Allman Brothers Band. Closer to home, this very campus, the Allman Brothers played Memorial Gymnasium. That's still the same gym, right? That's here. They haven't rebuilt that. Do we know? In April of 1971, it was documented in the paper. You can look in the lower right-hand corner. The tickets were all of $2. This is about 5 weeks after Fillmore East was recorded in New York, and it is also about a month after a major drug bust they had in Jackson, Alabama. Literally days after the Fillmore East sessions when they go there. Okay, why a book about one album? So that's a little background to the story. And I'll get a little deeper into some of these things too, but I do like to give us some context to where we're at. If I was to spend time talking about the Middle Tennessee roots of the Allman Brothers, I don't think I would ever, this would just take days and hours. So to give you a little snippet for those who like that sort of stuff. So the question is, why a book about one album? So I want to explain a couple things. Number one, what an album represents the book explains, I hope, what an album represents in 1971 to Duane. And I'll just say very quickly, this was the third album that they were recording. They had two absolute flop studio records. They were hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt to their record company, to their label. Their label's co-partner, Jerry Wexler, wanted to break the band up because he was convinced there was no way anything good was going to come out of the South. This was the go for broke opportunity for the Allman Brothers Band. And I think what's the most interesting to me about it is when presented with that issue, with, hey, we're going to break you up, and unless something happens, the answer the Allman Brothers had, and Duane had, and it fits their story, was we want to go record an album live. And that's important. It's not get your yayas out, which sounds like a concert. And for years, if you listen to it, it sounds like a concert, song by song. It took me years to realize that wasn't a live concert. It was a bunch of songs mixed, and there was some stuff done in post. That is absolutely not the case with that Fillmore East. There is not a single overdub on that album. And tracks are actually faded in and out as if each song is an individual song. So I had to reconceive of all of this. In the CD era, my first true introduction to this band was a double CD called the Fillmore Concerts that was mixed like a concert. All the songs were put out of order to the record. The old timers hated it because they changed the song order. Because they changed the song order to more reflect the Allman Brothers set list at the time. It was a great concert document, but it wasn't the album that they had released in '71 when they went for broke. So, like a lot of people will say, people who interview me who know this story and know what they're talking about, they'll call it they recorded the Fillmore concert, or it's the Fillmore, most people who approach this album, myself included, thought it was a concert document, thought about it as a live concert. And that was not how the Allman Brothers intended. It was an album released, and the only difference was they were in front of an audience because that's how they performed and played best. And so what this album means to the music industry, what it meant to listeners, we'll get to this in just a little bit. It's all in the book. It hit, and back to something that Greg and Chris and I talked about in the summer of 2014, reception theory. And how do we know what's going on between what a band wants to do and what the audience wants to do? And it should pay attention to what the audience is saying about that. And that was hard for me, by the way, with a band that I think is the greatest ever and never made a mistake, to conceive of a better way to approach that question is, why are they great, or what is memorable about this entire story? And to me, the story has often been told from a very journalistic perspective, the primary sources being the sources that the people themselves have done the interviews. And I only realized this about the last probably 12 months. About the time I was finished, I turned in the first manuscript and I was thinking about how different things were. And I used all sources from all over the place, including a shit ton of sources from the fans. And the fans being people when we were in college writing reviews for student newspapers, more or less. And I say when we were in college because that gives us all a sense of who we would have been at that moment. Maybe a little more advanced than the other kids because we are trying to, we've got this extra geeky thing we're doing. Most kids aren't paying attention to it, but at least this is how we know how people heard the band and what they did. The Allman Brothers had already had three miserable failures. The brothers Allman at Superstardom, Nashville in 1966. Actually, they first went to New York in 1966 with a group called the Sandpipers, a girl singing group. Look them up, it's a great story. Then they failed there. They actually auditioned for Bob Johnston, Dylan's producer, while Dylan was doing Blonde on Blonde. And I did verify that the dates line up, that yes, indeed, they had gotten an audition. Bob Johnson was there doing Blonde on Blonde, that thing. Then they go out to Los Angeles and they form the Hourglass, which we'll get to in just a second. The other question that I get all the time, bad segue, but for me, the question I used to get when I first started to like the band from everybody was, wasn't he married to Cher? And what's funny is after all this time, there's some worse pictures. There's a great video I post kind of regularly of Cher doing an interpretive dance on her TV show to Midnight Rider. It's one of the most cringe things, from an Allman Brother fan perspective, except for the keytar that comes out a little bit later. But the fact of the matter is that this is a really, really, really rich, robust story. If we look at bands like a sports team with successes, which I've been using that analogy, or if you look at bands as institutions, if you will, this is an absolute American institution that outlived its founder by 43 years. And the fact of the matter is, when he died, the rocket had just taken off. And he died before he saw any of it. And the craziest thing to me, and I did dig deep on this, because the question that's always been since I came on board in the 90s was, they would always talk about, we got to go back to the original sound. We want to go back to every time they would break up, every time they would do an album, they were always compared to the guys on the left, 100% of the time. And they always talked about it. And then when things didn't go well for them, when they broke up, they would say, we lost that spirit, or we lost that feeling, et cetera, et cetera. So what I, wanted to do was sort of get a little bit more of a sense of what that was and what it meant. And what was, or why was, or how did that fierce devotion to this concept carry through for this entire time? And I'll say this, I mean, that's the group on the right, that's their final bow in New York City with the last lineup that played on, they were good at this, but it was the 28th of October turned into the 29th, which was the anniversary of Duane's death date. So kind of very apropos how they pulled that off in New York. Also for you New Yorkers or city people, they paid in advance for the overtime, but they were way, way, way over overtime. They played way into the wee hours of the morning. Yes. Okay, so back to the pillars. I mentioned place being one, the South being that specific place. Duane Allman is really the center of this story. Chris, you said to me as I was walking out after you gave me some notes on the dissertation, congratulations, blah, blah, blah. And you said, make it more on Duane, center it more on Duane. And my dissertation, I had tried to stay out of some of that because I felt like I am a fanboy. And I got called on it. Van West called me on it more than once, and rightfully so. Like, I'm really thankful for that. So I had to be careful. I am learning right now how to maybe bring a little more of that, I feel like more of that back out, to be able to sort of say like, yeah, this was a really special cat. And he did some really cool stuff. I think one of the first things that really attracts me to him is he's very inclusive in how he approaches music. Greg and I will do a little bit of an example of that in a second. It's for two people to be able to just sit down and say, okay, we're going to talk a little bit off with no words. That reflects me and what I know from him. Improvisation was a really important part of his toolkit. They pulled this directly really from jazz. I was talking with Greg a little bit ahead of time. They are the psychedelic angle of the jazz impulse. And really, I struggle with this too. Actually, I didn't struggle with this. What I finally ended up saying was, I got in touch with Dennis McNally, who's he's a PhD historian, but he's the Dead's publicist, their historian. And I was like, hey, can you help me define psychedelic rock? I had pulled all my texts out, had found nothing I liked, and he wrote what's in the book. But it's essentially an attempt at jazz by people who may or may not be able to play very well, but some of them could, with the big dose of psychedelic drugs in it. That's really the difference to me. It's rock musicians trying to play something like jazz. The Allman Brothers were very good at it because they were very intentional in the way that they approached their music. So it wasn't free form. It wasn't let's go try to find the magic traipsing along this journey, which is what, to me, a good Grateful Dead jam is. All right, let's go find that magic. Let's go traipse around in the woods a little bit with some really cool Robert Hunter lyrics that make me think of English countrysides or little gardens, right? The Allman Brothers we are going that way. It may take us a little while to get there because sometimes we're going to go plow through groups of people or we're going to do that, and the musicians themselves are determining which way you go. And if you listen to At Fillmore East, if you can concentrate enough on it, if you can hear the comping behind the soloist, that's some of the most magical stuff that goes on, and that was intentional. That was their goal when they started. And I think it's important to remember when you listen to At Fillmore East, there is not a single zero overdub on that album. There's a patch of 2 versions of You Don't Love Me, literally split at the point where Dickie picks up the solo. And then Stormy Monday is, they removed a harmonica solo that they end up putting back in a lot later. Their goal was to hit the note. That's a term that Allman Brothers fans abuse a lot, where they talk about it a lot, but I'm gonna read the quote, which is hitting your peak, hitting the place where we all like to be. I think this is a Barry Oakley quote. When you're feeling your best, that's what you describe as your note, when you're really able to put all of you into it and get that much out of it. When you start hitting like that, the communication between the members of the band gets wide open. Stuff just starts coming out everywhere. Colonel Bruce Hampton has a quote, pure as hell, is how he remembered the early days of the Allman Brothers band when they started. Okay, I mentioned before Duane's bandmates. I think this is another really important part of the story, and some friends of mine who love this story, but really not maybe from the history perspective. A friend of mine really said, you really need to highlight more that this guy was at the top of his game when he formed the Allman Brothers band, and yet he formed a band of musical equals. That's really a remarkable thing. So the story goes, I'll say very quickly, Duane had a lot of fits and starts in his career and wasn't doing very well. Records with Wilson Pickett on Hey Jude and at Fame and Muscle Shoals Sound. It is a smash hit. The story of the recording is fantastic. Bottom line is the 2 of them couldn't go out to eat because one was a hippie and the other was a black guy. So the session crew, the rhythm section, went to eat, and those guys stayed back. Duane convinced him to record it, blistering solo at the end, and it became a massive hit. And Duane immediately got a contract. First with Rick Hall at Fame, and then with Phil Walden bought the contract from him. That's the music industry support that's coming up. He has a chance to do kind of the Jimi Hendrix Experience, a little power trio thing, and he hates it. He tries it. If you've listened to it, it's not very good. It's okay. J-Mo, the black dude in the middle, shows up, and they send him there because he's shown up in Macon to play in a rhythm section that hasn't existed yet, that never ends up existing, actually. He leaves Macon, goes to Muscle Shoals, meets Duane. The question is, when J-Mo is sent to Duane, they say, we got this guy, he plays so weird, nobody knows if he's any good or not. And Duane says, are you kidding, man? This cat's burning. One of my favorite lines he's ever said. So he and J-Mo start playing, and they pick up the dude in the pink shirt, second from the left. That's Barry Oakley, who's playing bass. But Barry Oakley's in a band with the guy on the far left who looks like Doc Holliday. That's Dickie Betts. And they're in a band called The Second Coming in Jacksonville. Barry doesn't want to leave without Dickie. So J-Mo leaves Muscle Shoals with Duane leaves Muscle Shoals with J-Mo and basically takes up shop with Barry and Dickie in and around Jacksonville, Florida. Butch Trucks, the dude in the hat kind of hiding there, is also from Jacksonville and a contemporary from Florida. Actually, they had known him on the Florida touring circuit. And eventually they call Greg. Greg was actually the last person to join the Allman Brothers band. So it was the Allman band, or the Duane Allman project. Greg was actually the last person. I'll quickly do this because this is a fascinating story, but it takes a lot of time to talk about. The partnership of Jerry Wexler and Phil Walden, I don't think I can do it with the thing. Phil Walden is the upper right-hand corner, second from the right. There's two white dudes. He's the white dude in the dark shirt. That's a dark jacket. And then Jerry Wexler, I think you can see him. He's sitting down. They formed a record company basically built around Duane. And frankly, it's a record company that becomes completely successful because of this gamble at the very beginning. Eventually, bankruptcy, drugs, all kinds of problems, including, there's a little rumor that maybe Georgia was looking after Phil Walden a bit because of all his support for Jimmy Carter. And they were trying to sort of subvert Jimmy Carter's campaign a little bit. I think there's a little truth to all of that. But at this age and era, Wexler and Walden are partners in Capricorn Records, which is a subsidiary of Atlantic Records that Wexler is vice president of. Walden is also the Allman Brothers Band's manager. He runs their publishing company and their booking company, all under separate operations. If that sounds like it's a really major conflict of interest that ends up really hurting the Allman Brothers Band from a financial standpoint, it absolutely is. And it also really wrecked Walden too. It was pretty common, but eventually when the bands and artists start figuring out what's going on behind the scenes, they raise a ruckus. The biggest thing, though, that they let the Allman Brothers do was stay in the South. That was a vitally important part of this story, place and the South itself, not just as a source for music, not just as their culture or source for their culture, but also as their home. It really was where, and for the most part, for much of their earliest era, they all stayed in and around the South. They started migrating out California, particularly Greg, in the mid-'70s from there. Now, the final one is the audience. And because honestly, without us, what is all this for except a couple people playing music together? I'm really proud of the book. It wasn't my first my title, but Play All Night is actually from At Fillmore East. If you know it, it's at about 16 minutes and 18 seconds. And it is the second major decrescendo part in the song. Everything drops out. It's Duane Allman playing his guitar. And a couple thousand people in New York City are dead quiet. You can hear the rustling, but they're listening really intently. And that's a great part of the album. If you listen to the quiet parts, those people they're intently listening. They're probably stoned out of their minds, and that's okay, but they are intently listening. But this guy just goes, you guys know, play all night. I've probably met at least 5 people who claim to be that person in my life. I've also met way more Woodstock veterans than I imagine are actually Woodstock veterans, right? But this is, kind of where I get to it. And I thought a lot about my training here at MTSU. And the discussions I've had with many of you here, trying to figure this part out, how to talk about what the audience says. And the key for me was when I could unlock the fact that that I could say what Duane Allman said he wanted to accomplish from music. I could clearly say what his bandmates said, the people around them said. The question was, did the audience is that what they heard? And it was 100% exactly what they heard, in different ways, of course, because that's how artists are communicating with their audiences. But the fan culture itself is a vital part of this story, and they're also who kept it alive. I had to wean out contemporary remembrances of past concerts. I had a lot more of that in the dissertation, and rightly so, pointed out those aren't the best examples they seem, and I knew that going in. I had to sort of try it, for myself. But then when you scrub 144,000 words to 85, you're not just killing individual words. There's entire concepts that go away in a manuscript at that point. But I'm really proud of this part. And I will say that 3 of you in particular have an influence in how that came out in the book, just from our discussions in the different angles that we take. And that was what Spencer told me. He said, look, this is what they said they wanted to do. They put out a record that did that, and everybody liked it for that reason. And I was like, oh, a historical argument can be like that simple, in all honesty. So this was really a turning point for me, the fifth pillar of this story. I've talked a bit about them, Duane and Greg, for a second. I did tell you they're from Nashville. Their dad was killed. He was a D-Day veteran, had jumped at D-Day, actually was killed by basically a hitchhiker. And they grew up between Daytona Beach and Castle Heights and up here. And then they ended up mostly in Daytona Beach. Greg dropped out of high school. Duane dropped out of high school. Greg graduated in 1965, and they immediately took to the road from there. They were very inspired by WLAC out in Nashville. I don't think I need to tell anybody in this room how important WLAC is there. B.B. King is a touchstone to any guitarist of that generation and any blues guitarist I think ever. That's Jimmy Reed on the right, who were the first artists that Duane and Greg copied. They spent a lot of time in the black clubs in Daytona Beach. And I think it's a pretty subversive act. I don't think it was intentionally subversive, but the good music was on the west side of the Intercoastal in Daytona Beach, and they spent a lot of time in the black neighborhood. And Floyd Miles, who was an early contemporary, was in early bands with them, a black man, said, it was a frightening thing. Duane was one of the few white guys that would go in the black neighborhood and play. They had long hair and were weird. The bond was built between us because we all experienced some kind of discrimination. Which kind of ties back to the Wilson Pickett story in Muscle Shoals, that you can't go out to dinner because you got long hair. And there's a lot of, that's another thread that's in the book. The book I didn't write, y'all, is the gender. There's a lot of, I missed opportunities for more of that, and I'm hoping more folks will address that, because there's a lot of long hair stories that I never really did much with, because I just didn't know where I would go with it. So, but that was an issue. This is one of my favorite pictures of all time of the Allman brothers on the left. Think about it. The guy, in this, there's Duane is here with the 335. That's Greg with, I think it's a Mustang. That's the band that did Whipping Post. But you see these guys in their khakis and Norwegians and those sorts of things doing the Watusi or whatever else. This is a high school graduation party for Greg's senior class. I've not been able to document if it's his party that he skipped out on, but I think it's pretty funny. But they hit the road as the Allman Joys, and really they were the first band, and a lot of folks remember this as being the first band to make it from the South and pursue music and try to do something full time. Gary Rossington of Lynyrd Skynyrd says, we were chubby little high school boys, and they were like rock stars, skinny guys with long hair, long blonde hair and leather jackets, which is great. They were discovered in 1967, quote unquote, by Bill McEwen, who was manager of the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. He moves them to LA and dresses them up in these clothes. That picture of Duane with the doily around his neck is one of my least favorite pictures of him ever. This is from a television show. It was an absolute disaster for all of them. It looks as manufactured as it was. They were trying to make Greg the front man, which was an issue, by the way, that continued throughout their early career. There was an argument in May of '69 about the early Allman Brothers. Get that good-looking guy from behind the organ and put a salami in his pants and have him go dance around. That was Butch Trucks' long quote there. They go down to Muscle Shoals and record at Fame, a demo. And one of those tracks is a B.B. King medley. If you listen to it, it was on the first Duane anthology. It's the second, third, and fourth tracks from B.B. King's Live at the Regal. And the arrangement is note perfect. And the playing is actually lets Duane go just a little bit. They go back with these demos to Liberty Records in LA, and Liberty just absolutely rejects them. And basically, Duane quits the band at that point. He had two unsuccessful records. He was still under contract. So Greg has to go back to LA to fulfill a contract. That's why he wasn't in Jacksonville when the Allman Brothers Band forms. And that's what's going on in Jacksonville, actually. The Second Coming, which is Barry Oakley, upper right-hand corner. He's playing the big white bass. That's a Guild Starfire bass. Dickie Betts, far left, upper left-hand corner with his wife, Dale. Their daughter is actually married to Frank Hannon of Tesla. So Frank Hannon is Dickie Betts' son-in-law. Side note, whenever you can get any of you people say something like that, I know I've hit a note with that one there. They were already forming this hippie. I was just listening to an interview about this coming over. There was a thriving hippie culture in Jacksonville, Florida in 1968, 69. And the Second Coming was in the middle of it. Duane joins a very robust scene. This is actually photos on the right. I think that is actually Willow Branch Park on the right. That's me. I took the photo there on the left. But there is a park in this Riverside neighborhood where they jammed. This is it becomes part of the Allman Brothers story. They go play parks for the rest of their early career. They regularly play free parks. And Duane joins these jam sessions when he comes in. I told you the Wilson Pickett story. In the meantime, he drives to Muscle Shoals, and I'm not kidding. This is all happening in the span of about 5 months I'm talking about, and records Hey Jude. And then he starts putting his band together. So I want to go back to the Hey Jude because I had the quote I needed to say. It's amazing how one incident, one session can change a person's life. That's what Jimmy Johnson of the Fame Gang, later Muscle Shoals Swampers, said. Duane got a contract, and what his choice was to put a band together. And he put a band together with 2 drummers, which is not unheard of. I unpacked this a little bit, but it is unique, and it still is unique. And I think the main reason it's unique is because nobody has 2 drummers ever. But most drummers start off in marching band, or many do, as did J-Mo and Butch. So the idea is weird, and they can tend to get in their way. The right drummer, right combination, etc. Duane wanted 2 drummers. He told J-Mo because James Brown had 2 drummers and Otis Redding had 2 drummers. Brown and Redding did not use his drummers at the same time, and J-Mo had been Otis Redding's drummer for a time in 1966. All honesty, I think he just liked it. There's a great quote. He says, somebody asked him, why do you have 2 drummers? And he said, we knew we were going to be playing hard and a lot, and we didn't want just one guy to have to flog, literally, this is his term, quote, flog his ass off all night. So it works out brilliantly. These guys join jam sessions, and then on March 23rd, 1969, they gather in this front left room of this house. This is in Jacksonville, Florida, the Riverside neighborhood, and have a jam. Everybody but Greg is there. Greg is still in Los Angeles. And apparently after this 3-hour massive jam that included Reese Winans, who ended up playing with Stevie Ray Vaughan, among many others, he basically stood in the door and says, anybody in this room not going to play in my band, you're going to have to fight your way out. That was basically the birth of the Allman Brothers Band. Duane calls Greg, he's still in Los Angeles, and says, these cats love to play. They're all really into their instruments. They sing a little bit, but there's not a whole lot of writing going on. I need you to come and sing and write and round it all up and send it out some sort of direction. Greg called it finest compliment he ever heard, led that band for 43 years after his brother died. I think some way in his honor. The band is comprised of 6 Southerners. That's Johnny Johnson, also known as J-Mo of Ocean Springs, Mississippi. Huge jazz hand. I'm going to play a bit of that for just a second. And rhythm and blues drummer. Barry Oakley plays bass. I think the most remarkable thing about him more than anything else is the lead bass that he plays. I'm also really proud of how I unpacked that a little bit in the book. I hope you guys like it when you get to it. He was a guitarist in Chicago originally and moved to Florida. He was in Tommy Roe's band. Do y'all know Tommy Roe, Dizzy? The guy who wrote the bass line to Whipping Post backed up Dizzy for a time on the road. I can't jibe those 2 things in my mind. I really can't. I know that's how it works, but I just can't. Butch Trucks is from Jacksonville. Originally, he was a big folk rock fan, and they called him the Freight Train. And the other thing about Butch, also very happy about this, he was a huge fan of classical music. And I am not a huge fan of classical music, but I appreciate it very much. I don't know it real well. And I thought a lot about how do I represent this? How does this come across in the thing? So here's a couple ways I discuss it off the cuff. The book I did a lot better, Greg, forgive me. But honestly, there's 2 things. The most obvious one is the use of the timpani in the first place. I don't think anybody else uses it in rock. And it is on at least 3 songs that were recorded at Fillmore East. It was on Hotlanta, at the end of Hotlanta. It's at the end of Whipping Post, and then it's at the beginning of Mountain Jam, which is not on at Fillmore East. It's on the next record. The other thing about that I think he contributes or he is very comfortable with, so that's the obvious one, is the length of the songs with the multiple movements, ebbs and flows, swells up, swells back down. Again, it's improvised. That's not how classical music is performed, but it is also multiple parts playing their own part to make one cohesive sound. So that's Butch's classical influence. This is Dickie Betts. He's from West Palm Beach, Florida. So 4 of the original 6 are from Florida, and 5 of 6 are living in Florida when they found the band. Dickie grew up really listening to a lot of what he called string music, not bluegrass. He says specifically, we didn't call it bluegrass yet, it was string music. And Western swing, which has a lot of harmony and a lot of harmony guitars. And he just really loved that. And he and Duane, that was one of the immediate things those two picked up on together. He also was Duane's equal by every measure. Wasn't quite as confident, became a songwriter and a composer because he wrote multiple instrumentals for the band. He wasn't as confident as Duane initially, but really came into his own as a band leader after Duane's death. He became their musical director for about 30 years. And the final one is Duane and Greg. They were the original partnership there. They moved to Macon in spring, in April of 1969. They were really only in Jacksonville, Florida for about a month, actually only a couple weeks as a sextet. They were all but Greg in Jacksonville, maybe for about 5 weeks, maybe 6 weeks total. This is the big house in Macon where they eventually moved. This is sort of headquarters, Allman Brothers Band headquarters, from 1970 to about 73. And it's now a museum for the Allman Brothers Band. They end up touring around the country. They did 300 shows a year, and they regularly would set up and 300 days a year on the road, 200 shows a year. And honestly, there's a ton of free shows where they would just set up gear and play, especially in 69 and 70, that we have no documentation of. Really no idea how many shows they played, but it was a lot. They had incredibly poor album sales. They released 2 albums. Their debut in late 1969, November of 69, Idlewild South in September of 70, and then June, July of 71, they issued at Fillmore East. The first 2, abysmal. I don't think that they topped a grand total of 100,000 units together. This was their only option, was to record a live album. Bud Scapa writes, go to an Allman Brothers show, you'll hear the force of the whole band playing with that incredible single-mindedness that gets people on their feet after practically every number. But that was not the case from their first 2 records. Then they released at Fillmore East. And it was pretty much an immediate hit. Within 6 weeks, it hit gold, 500,000 units, so it way topped what their previous output had been. It was perfect for FM radio, and I do a decent amount of that in the book, sort of unpacking the difference between AM and FM radio. I have my favorite quote in the book is M. Scripp, who says, basically he says, please view this as a letter of complaint. After spending a small fortune in hard-earned money amassing a very fine record collection I recently purchased at Fillmore East. After smoking up some excellent homegrown marijuana, 1 joint only, I then played the album. My complaint is this: after listening to your beautiful music, the rest of my records seem irrelevant. Thank you very much for a wonderful performance. Hope to see you live. That came from Canada, actually. I think it was Quebec. And it's just titled M. Scripp. I cannot find the person. I would love to. But there is, to me, an example on multiple examples of reception of a record that they were wanting and expecting. This letter was postmarked November of 71, so it would have been sent after Duane had died. Some of my favorite pictures, but I guess it's not, there we go. These are some of my, these pictures are so compelling. I don't know why anybody took pictures of the funeral. But Duane dies in a motorcycle accident, October 29th, 1971. The band had just gotten notice that the record had hit gold. The comment he makes to the roadie was, "No more beans for breakfast." They were on the road to superstardom. He's killed in a motorcycle accident. He's driving a little bit recklessly. He's probably not sober, but there's really no proof of that. Somebody turned in front of him. He was driving too fast. They stopped mid-turn, and he tried to get around them and couldn't, and died. Why this picture is so remarkable to me is the band actually set up and played the funeral. And the quote Greg says is, "We played a gig at the funeral." I will say, as a person who has played at every one of my families, and because of this idea, I was like, that's the only way I can express how I feel right now, is if I play a little bit of music. I think it's absolutely astounding to me that they did it. By all accounts, it was a great set, They made the decision at that point to continue as a 5-piece. And they went out and recorded really what was then their most successful album, Eat a Peach. They finished that record. And then shortly after that, Barry Oakley dies in a remarkably similar situation. He's about a quarter mile away, and even worse, just in terms of the Southern Gothic nature of this tale, they're literally on parallel roads, like going down this, like it's the most, and one was killed here and one was killed here. It's literally a quarter mile apart, just a couple blocks away. You couldn't script it, because they at that point they had the number 4 record in the land with Eat a Peach. They go out actually as a sextet. They play 90 dates, and Barry Oakley ends up dying at the end of that. I didn't say this in the book. I probably should have. I've thought about it later, but it clearly cost Barry Oakley his life to go out there, and that saved the band. They continued on after that point from there. Their next big record is Brothers and Sisters. For my fellow historians, I did my best to hew the line on the Confederate iconography, which surrounds this terminology. The good news for my book is it was not a major part of anything I'm talking about or time. So the bad news is I'll probably never be truly satisfied with how I wrote that. But they become the biggest band in the land. This album hits number 1. Ramblin' Man hits number 2. It's their only top 10 hit when they go through. I'm going to leave us with this picture, which I would encourage you to read the captions. I took the captions, and the way that I constructed the photos was I thought a lot about what was in the images versus just an image and just defining it. This is sort of my museum nerd kind of side. So this picture captures, I have it, this is on my wall. If you look closely, you'll see Greg is looking over to watch what's happening. Butch is looking pretty intently either at Dickie or at Barry. Dickie's the one in the middle leaning back. J-Mo's totally into his own thing, but I mean, these are like 5 guys that are truly, a photographer captured something that truly matters, which is these guys are, and they're going full bore right now. And the attention they're paying to each other is really, really, really startling to me when I look at it. The other thing is how incredibly tight the stage is. So nowadays, when I see bands, even smaller bands, they have so much room to walk around. This is not the Fillmore East stage. Actually, I've got a picture of that one, because I think this is the Fillmore East stage. And you see how close that they are. It was a vaudeville stage, so it was an actual theater, but the Beacon Theater today, where the Allman Brothers played for a number of years, I mean, they were arrayed across that thing, and nowhere near the stage lip at all when it comes through. So when I think about Duane Allman's legacy, and this is at the tail, and I'll leave it there, it's his intent, it's improvisation, audience reception. Actually, that's something I should have said. Audience reception mattered so much, they recorded an album that included it. Like that was so important to them, and I guess I should have maybe said that from the beginning. They were a band of equals that played original music. That was something else I had to unpack. Like, why didn't they make it before? Was because they were playing cover songs. They were very good at it. They were having a musical conversation. And I do think they are some of the most premier musical conversationalists in all of rock music. And there are arguments for a lot of people, and if I'm having beers with you or something on site, I will really vociferously say greatest ever kind of deal. But in this case, I'm not saying they're the greatest, but they are conversationalists. Very, very, very much so when they play, and especially on this album at Fillmore East. Okay, we have 5 minutes. My intention, I got to figure out how to get all this information down a little bit slower. Does anybody have any questions?
What other really, really big albums had come out that were live albums?
None. So what was going on, and I have this in there. One of the things that was going on is they had, so the Beach Boys live, which was not a live record, but that was like the one they're like, oh, we can do this? Like we can put this out and people will buy it. It was, and then in the rock, right? Because the other, B.B. King was doing live records and Muddy Waters was doing live records. James Brown, okay, so the MC5's first record was recorded live, but it wasn't intended to be a live record. James Brown's Live at the Apollo, definitely. But most of it seemed to be in the rhythm and blues soul area, if you will, as ways to kind of repurpose your hits. Johnny Cash, Folsom, and San Quentin would be probably the next, and he's sort of reintroducing himself to the marketplace. He's been around forever. An artist at their stature doing a live album at this juncture is absolutely unheard of. Cream had done Wheels of Fire, half of that was live. So it had become a thing, but it was not.
Hendrix, right?
Okay, so and that was just because he had to fulfill an album contract. You're talking Band of Gypsies? Yeah. So, I mean, the Dead are the closest corollary to this because they released Live Dead in 68 or 69, as a live record to get out of debt from their record company because their previous things had failed too. But it wasn't a hit. What it did is it allowed Grateful Dead fans to rally around the record, and it still stayed pretty underground because they just toured. And they were a really well-known entity by that point. The Dead were.
What about from the jazz world?
So I was thinking, Train, that would be the other. Yeah, rhythm and blues or jazz probably gets more African American. Train, it's either Live at the Village Vanguard is the one. I've got it in there too, but that would be where the trend had been happening. The Stones issued, I can't remember when Get Your Ya-Ya's came out, but again, that was in the middle of a brilliant stretch of records they were putting out that were selling like hotcakes. It was just a matter of it's easy, let's record this and issue it out. This one was completely different. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. Do you want to try it?
It's up to you.
Yeah. All right, let's do it. Turn this thing on. So what we're going to do, I'm going to just show a little example of it, I guess. Greg and I, we only first played together about a minute ago. But the thing that I want to show you, I'm going to show you all real quick, is this. So the Allman Brothers song Dreams is the song I really wanted to, okay. All right, so what I'm going to do is show you how jazz influences the Allman Brothers Band. And this is the best way I can do it right here. So Greg Allman brings in a song called Dreams in essentially 4/4 time. And somehow the band decides they want to change it to waltz time, which is 6/8. And they're listening to this album by Miles Davis, and really this song all is blues. And so this gives the vibe that they want. I'm going to play that first, and I'm going to play the Allman version. Just for a second. All right. Flowing with it? Good? Will this just supersede it? Or do I have to stop?
Yeah, stop that.
All right. Now, here's kind of how the Allman Brothers adapt the form, the feel. And by the way, JMO's drums, which are going to be panned, I think, left for those of you who can hear in 2 years, he's literally doing the drum lick from All Blues when he's doing it, okay? All right. So essentially, what's going on, you can explain this better than me as a musicologist, but the band has decided that they're just going to hang out on. It's the chorus of the or the verse of the song, which is just basically riding two chords, C's and D's. So it's what they call a vamp. I think all of you guys know what that is, right? So we're just going to play that, and it's just basically the verse part vamp. Just let Greg get his rocks off, I'll get my rocks off a little bit, and then just sort of wrap it up and do it that way, just to give an example. You cool?
Yeah, that's good.